Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Let's go and have a recap of a reading I did in February. So in January, I had a really good reading month to start off the year. There were lots of highly scored books. I think the lowest rating I gave was a 4, which is fantastic. And in February, that trend continued. I had another really good month. So as usual, we'll take a look at the stats first of all and then go into the books, and there'll be timestamps down below so you can skip the stats section if it's not one that you enjoy. So in February I read 7 books, and I also had a DNF which I don't include in my stats at any point, including the number of pages that I did read before DNFing it. So in total for the 7 books that I finished, I read 3,666 pages, which is an average of 524 pages per book, and the average rating I gave those books, with one caveat which I'll go through in a moment, was 4.42. For the year to date, that moves my total pages read to 7,454, the average page count to 621, and the average rating to 4.36. For the series update, I've started 4 new series this year so far. I haven't finished any as yet, and I've also not read the opening book of the series so far that I've then decided not to continue with. Series 1 I'm up to date with is standing at the moment at 15, and the total ongoing series is at 31. And then as usual, the last little stat is the day since my last 5-star read, which as of today's date, the day of filming, is standing at 7 days. So I did say there was a little caveat there, and this will be the same for possibly the next 2 months, certainly for March as well as February's stats. I am reading the SPFBO finalists, and there are some of the finalists in SPFBO 8 which just really are not my thing. So in the interests of fairness, I've decided not to rate those books on Goodreads. I've given a review to one of them, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but I haven't actually given a star rating because it would be unfair for me to do so. And similarly, not because it would be unfair, but because it would just be an anomaly that would just really skew my stats, I've decided not to include the rating for those books that are so far outside of my wheelhouse in my personal stats as well. So the total page count and the average page count that I've just given you for February stats is for 7 books, but the average rating is for 6 because one of them I have excluded. So let's go and have a look at the books and we'll find out more about that one. So first of all, the book that's not included in any of my stats is the one that I decided not to continue with. This is The Crew by Sadir S. Samir, which was kindly gifted to me by the author. We did both think that it might not be my thing, but the author wanted me to give it a try anyway, and I was happy to give it a try. And this one actually came out of my TBR jar, which was quite handy because otherwise I don't know when I would have got to it. This one was quite interesting. I like the world building with the god dust that you have, which gives kind of magical, almost superhero, I suppose, powers. That was something really interesting that I would have liked to hear more from had I continued with the book, but obviously I didn't, so I didn't get too deep into the world building side of it or the magic side of it. I didn't really like the main character, and as the main character, he's kind of the draw. You can't really get away from him. So if a main character's really not working for you, chances are in any book that you're not going to have such a good time with it. With this one, I just thought he was too overpowered. He was stronger, faster, had better senses, or at least better vision than basically anyone else. He had hollow bones, so he was really light and he could practically fly. And he had a power where he could move his internal organs around. So if you stabbed him in the heart, he'd move his heart at the last moment, and then the actual wound itself would heal really quickly as well. So it was just a little bit too much, but he was also too much of a wisecracker. He's been likened to Deadpool, but it didn't work for me. I love the Deadpool humour, but not the humour in here, sadly. I found that too often there was a battle about to start, and whether it was just a one against many in a bar, for instance, which is kind of where we start off, he's too interested in wisecracking rather than getting down to business, so to speak. So it didn't really work for me, and I decided to put it down. But I know plenty of people in my little circle of friends who have read this and have really enjoyed it. Sadly, I wasn't able to join them though. The book that came out of my TBR jar in January was actually the first book that I read in February. I started it in January but didn't finish it, so I carried it over, and that was A Fool's Hope by Mike Shackle, book 2 of The Last War. And I really had a good time with this. I loved We Are the Dead. It was one of my favourite reads of last year, and I'm glad that I got to this one early on in 2023. This one did have some issues that I didn't really agree with or that I didn't really like. There was an element of time travel which it almost seemed like kind of a cheap shot. There was essentially there was one specific thing that it achieved, and I appreciated the results of that. I appreciated what it achieved, because that one particular thing would have been perhaps difficult to write into the story the way it happened. So yeah, it was always going to be a bit of a difficult one, and the time travel essentially solved that. But it's not something that I'm generally a fan of, and the same could be said for this one. There were also, similarly to what I was saying with The Crew, there was a bit of overpowering of a couple of the characters, which I didn't really like so much, but pretty much everything else I really liked. I loved the intensity they had with some of the battles. I loved the fighting back from rebellion, which was the big theme of book 1, which I really enjoyed, and again I really enjoyed it in here as well. So definitely looking forward to book 3 and finishing this series off, because if it's anything like books 1 and 2, it's going to be a great one. Those couple of things that I didn't really like just took 5 stars away from this one, so I ended up giving it 4.5. Then I picked up an advanced review copy that the author kindly offered me. This was for The Bloody Chorus by John Marco, and you can see my review up in the cards in the top corner there for this book. But again, it's another one that I had a really good time with. It was some really interesting world building with first of all, the different peoples, and there are some peoples in here, you can just about make them out, I think, on the cover. They've got blue skin, and they're basically human. You forget that they're not human, I guess, until there's some little tells that come up in the story that show that they're not human, but to all intents and purposes, they are very much like us. It was a really interesting world, though, with the living gods that they had, and it's not really a naval-based novel, but there are some scenes that appear, including battle scenes, on the open water, and you can see again on the cover you've got these big beasts, which there's a couple of things that they could be. It could be dragon whales, or it could be these big sea serpents that appear in a couple of scenes, but either way, all of those elements were really interesting. I really enjoyed them. I thought they were really well done. The story itself I was quite a fan of. I liked the overall plot, I liked the characters, I liked the way that they interacted. So yeah, overall it was a real good time for me, and I'm looking forward to reading some more, hopefully, in this world and with these characters. This is another one that I gave 4.5 stars to, so you can see already that my February was shaping up to be a fantastic reading month. While I was reading The Bloody Chorus, I was listening to an audiobook as well. This was the first in the buddy read that I'm doing with Nina for The Expanse. I'd read book 1 quite some time ago, several years it was, and Nina had just read it, I think, in January, so we picked up book 2 and read it together, or listened to it together, and again, this is one that I had a really good time with. So book 2 in The Expanse is Caliban's War. I've seen the TV show, and when I was listening to this, so much of the TV show was coming back to me. I could literally see the scenes in my head. So it's quite good and quite interesting, because I'm quite a, I don't know if it's the right terminology, but I'm quite a visual reader. I can picture things in my head as I'm reading them. But here, those pictures were from the TV show because I'd already seen it. So it's a bit weird, a bit different in that respect. But I think it really enhanced my enjoyment of it, really enhanced the experience I was having as I was listening to it. Some of the audio was, I guess, a little bit strange, because I was at the same time kind of, when you had certain characters who got very distinctive voices, I was trying to kind of merge what I was listening to with what I had already in my head from the TV show. So the prime example, because of the very distinctive voice, is Avasarala. And of course, with the narrator, you didn't get that kind of gravelly, warm butter voice that she has, but I really loved the character. So in the TV show, Amos and Avasarala are my favourites, and in the book, or at least this second book, Amos was great Avasarala, though, was just another level. She was absolutely amazing, and her on her own, the way that the character's written and her sassiness, I really, really loved, and that just elevated the book a whole star above what it might have been just on its own without her. As we were listening to it, Nina and I were typing out on Discord little quotes, little things that she'd said and done back and forth, and we both had a great time listening to her. She's such an amazing character, and I'm really looking forward to continuing with the series and getting beyond what I've seen in the TV show, but also to just experiencing more of this great character. So that's definitely one of the highlights that I had, both in terms of the book and the character. And Caliban's War is another one, a third in a row, that I gave 4.5 stars to. Next up was another arc that I read. I took on The Shadow Casket by Chris Wooding, which is book 2 of the Darkwater Legacy, so I really had a great time with The Ember Blade. Again, it was one of my favourite books of last year, and I was really looking forward to the sequel. It's a bit daunting because I think it was about 500, I think it was about 850 pages, so it took me quite a while to get through it, and I actually ended up because I left it a bit late because of other commitments that I had with loads of arcs in January. I actually ended up taking so much time over this because it was 800 odd pages that I actually hadn't finished it by the time the book was released. So when it was released, I realised that the audiobook was also released at the same time, which was fantastic because I listened to The Ember Blade and I loved the narration, and Simon Bubb also narrates book 2. So I put down my Kindle and I picked up The Shadow Casket on audio and continued that way. And again, I had a great time because I was already enjoying the story, but I loved the narration and the additional stuff that you got in there. And just like Caliban's War, one of the real highlights for me was one of the characters in particular. This time it was a bit more of a mix between the character, who he is, what he does, what he says, and also the voice for him, which I just think is really, really well done. So this is Grubb, and he's one of my favourite characters that I've certainly that I've experienced recently. I was just laughing at so much of the stuff that he said, and again, like I was saying for Avasarala in Caliban's War, he really kind of elevated my enjoyment of the story because I was enjoying it and things were going well, but then he would come along and say something, and it just really lightened up the scene for me. So that was fantastic. I really loved his development in this story as well as the story for Fen. I thought they both had some real good development. Some of the other characters, not quite so much, but overall the characters were well done. I thought it was a little bit strange because this book is set 3 years after the events of the first book. There is a particular reason that kind of comes into play. You learn later on why it's necessary essentially to have a 3-year gap, but for every other reason, if you take that out of the equation, everything else, it just seemed a little bit strange. It seemed like that one thing was in its own kind of little bubble, and for everything else, nothing was really changed. It's like both books, they have people who go different ways, whether it's the living going one way and the dead not going with them, for instance. But nothing really changed in those 3 years, except for this one little element of story in its own little bubble. So it was very strange. It didn't seem like characters had really changed feelings, they'd grown closer together or anything like that over this 3-year period. They just waited until the start of this book. So a little bit odd, but it didn't impact my enjoyment of it because I did have a great time overall. This one, because of a few little elements that I wasn't so sure on, including one particular trope involving that little kind of bubble on its own, which obviously being vague for spoilers, I wasn't 100% sure whether this was going to be a 5 or a 4.5, but then there were some absolutely amazing scenes, including some of the ones that I mentioned in terms of the character development for Fen and particularly Grubb, that just, I think, will really stay with me. So I did end up going for 5 stars in the end, leading to my first and only 5-star rating of the month. Okay, so the next one that I had was Springtide Harvest by J.D. Mitchell, which I was looking forward to. I thought this one was going to be a little bit of a different one, different to what I was reading for the rest of the month in a way, but also different for me. I'd heard that this was not a YA story, but one that maybe reads young. It's quite accessible for all ages, despite it being very much, I would say, an adult fantasy. It's a little bit of a strange one because I had a good time with it. First of all, I thought it was an interesting story. There were some interesting characters. You didn't see kind of too much of the world. It wasn't as in depth on the world building because the key focus really was the character side of things. But I thought that just some of the storytelling again was just not quite as in depth as I would have liked. The main thing that really, I guess, spoilt this book for me a little bit was just how easy everything was. So you've got a main character, Haskell, who's quite young. I think he has his 18th birthday during the events of the book, and we go along and we follow him as he leaves town and he goes off somewhere else. He wants to be a quester like his famous grandfather. He's got his grandfather's sword and he's got a load of money, and he goes out, joins the Questers Guild in this new town, and he goes off to clear a dungeon, so defeat all these goblins, whatever's in there, and see what treasures he can find. So he builds himself a group to go questing, and it's just a little bit too easy for me because it's like he's going around this town and saying to, there's a warrior, for instance, do you want to join my group? Yeah, okay. And then he throws a gold sovereign at them and says, meet me in a couple of days, we're going. And it's just, there's no real negotiation, there's no real kind of reluctance to join him, even though he's young and naive and nobody knows him. They all just decide, yeah, okay, we'll go along with you, and it's just taking along anybody and everybody that he meets, kind of thing. So it's just a little bit too easy in that sense. The other thing in particular that was a little bit too easy, and it's a bit spoilerish, so I do apologise. There's a scene where he finds a couple of in this dungeon. He finds a couple of potions, and he's testing them out with a wizard to see what they are. And the way to find out what these potions are is to try a little bit of them. So he's naive, as I say, he's young, he's inexperienced, he doesn't know what these things are, but he's tasting a potion which could kill him. But it's just tasting it to see what it is, basically, and saying, oh yeah, this is what it is because that's what I feel like after tasting it. And in particular, the potion that he tastes, I was just thinking to myself, how on earth would you know what that feels like? But, that's storytelling for you, I guess. It was a bit strange in another way as well, because, or it wasn't strange, but I felt that the pages turned really, really fast because there's a lot of blank space in here. So it was a very quick read, but also the writing style did actually help that as well, because it was very accessible and very free-flowing. So it was good overall. It just needed for me to really enjoy it a little bit more depth and a little bit more complexity, being slightly different things. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I continued my audio journey of The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes. Book 4 was next for me, and it was Sins of the Mother. So I've been listening to these because I've enjoyed the audio narration by Moira Quirks so much. She does absolutely fantastic as Esker, who is the first person narrator of this story. So I really, really have been loving that. The books themselves, I really enjoyed Along the Razor's Edge, first of all. It was a great introduction to this world, this story, this character. Books 2, 3 and this one 4, I thought were good. They weren't great, but the narration absolutely takes them up to another level. So I'm really glad that I've been listening to them rather than physically reading them. I'm sure I would enjoy them if I was, but I'm also sure I wouldn't enjoy them quite as much as I have done by listening to them. Anyway, this one, I can't go too much into the story or even some of the characters because we're 4 books deep into a series and I don't want to give spoilers even just by talking about particular characters, because then you'll know whether someone's alive or dead and so forth. Other than, of course, Esker, who is the narrator, so that's kind of a given, I guess. But yeah, some interesting world building, some interesting developments in this one. I did find at the end there was a bit too much time that was spent on explaining particular things. This one big cataclysmic thing that happens, and then whilst it's happening, we've got characters talking, discussing the reasons for it and stuff, and I'm just thinking, okay, we could have abbreviated that and then just get on with it and maybe go back to it later, I guess, when things have settled down a little bit, but they take a little bit too much time talking about it and explaining the whys for it and stuff like that. and it just took me away from this otherwise quite frantic scene. So that was a bit odd and a bit disappointing for me, but overall, I'm loving the story, I'm loving the character, I'm loving the audio narration as well. This was yet another 4.5 star read that I had this month. And then I ended up finishing my anticipated reading for February a little bit early. So because of that, I did pick up Antimatter Blues by Edward Ashton, which is one of my March reads. I'm not going to talk about it here because I'm only 20% into it at this point, and it's therefore going to be in my March wrap up. But one that I did read and finish because it was actually very short was Small Miracles by Olivia Atwater. This one is completely not my thing, but I'm reading all of the SPF VO8 finalists, of which this is one. So I feel a little bit weird talking about it because it's so far outside of my wheelhouse that my opinions, I feel, are invalid because this book isn't written for me. I am not the target audience for this one. So me saying that I had a terrible time with it, I really, really, really disliked this book, doesn't really mean anything because I'm not likely to like this book. My taste profile, I've said before, is quite narrow. Obviously I read epic fantasy, I read a bit of sci-fi, but I don't stray outside of that. I don't have eclectic tastes where I'll occasionally pick up a romance, a contemporary, a historical fiction even. I just don't do that. So when I do kind of experience books like that, they kind of mean nothing to me basically. I don't get on with them whatsoever, and that was definitely the case here. Now I did, because it was available, I did listen to this one. It meant that I could get through it in a day because it's quite short. It was about 7 hours I think of audio, and in general the audio narration was okay, nothing above that. But the one thing in terms of the audio that I really, really disliked with this book is it's full of footnotes. It's 250 pages and I think there were 94 footnotes. And each time there was a footnote, two things really annoyed me about it. Well, two things with the individual footnote. The footnotes themselves annoyed me because they don't always come in a convenient place to take you away from the story. That's kind of the point of the footnote, to avoid interrupting the flow. You can skip past it and carry on and then go back to the footnote later. But in the audio, you get the footnote where it's supposed to be. And each footnote is bookended, so at the start and at the end of it, to take you out and take you back into the story, you get the strumming of a harp. So it's really weird. And then there's a different tone that the narrator uses to read out the footnotes as well. So you'd be reading along and then you get this sound, and then you'd have kind of a really exaggerated, snooty, sort of looking down their nose at your upper class kind of voice that the narrator puts on to tell you a little joke or to tell you how many points this person has just gained for telling a little white lie or something along those lines. And then you'd get that sound again. So it just really took me out. And in the first chapter alone, I don't know how long the chapter was, but there were 9 footnotes, and then a few footnotes throughout the rest of the book, a few footnotes per chapter. So anyway, it was a really bad time in terms of the listening to it. I hated whenever I heard that harp strumming. It just kind of made me shudder a little bit. The story itself, the characters, did nothing for me because it's not my thing basically. And also the world building, again, just did nothing for me because when I'm reading my fantasy, I don't want to read anything of this world. I want a secondary world for a bit of escapism. And even in my sci-fi, I read far future because I don't want anything to do with Earth or Earth as we know it. And this one was just basically a contemporary story about a girl, or a few girls, and the only fantasy element in it is there's an angel basically. And it just really didn't work for me. I knew it wasn't going to, but I go into it with an open mind because I'm judging these for a competition, not officially for Cassidy's alternate SPFBO final. But although I had an open mind, I knew it wasn't going to be one that was for me, and it turned out I was right, it definitely wasn't. So I'm not rating it here. I'm not including a rating in my stats because it will skew them, as I said at the start of the video. I'm also, with these books, when I close it down on Goodreads, I'm not providing a rating on there. And I'll say in my review that I'm not rating it, and you can sort of take this with a pinch of salt or discard my review because it's really not for me. So it's not, as I said, what I feel to be a valid review. So anyway, no rating for this one, but it is now at least over for me. So a bit of rambling aside on that one, and excluding that one then from the generalisation of it, I had a fantastic month again in February, and I'm hoping that it's a sign of things to come. Great January, great February. Let's see what March and the rest of the year has. As usual, let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these, what did you think of them? But also, how did your February reading go? What was your favourite book that you had last month? I'll hopefully catch you in the next video sometime soon, but as always, until then, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.